I'm Summer Harvey, like you just said. I'm a third year at UVA, and today we're going to be talking about trends and predictors of hysterectomy. So before we start, I will just start with the background of how I got here. So this is me in 4th grade. We had to do a presentation for our history course or whatever, and we had to go as a historical figure, and most of the class went as a president, and I decided to go as Marie Curie because of 2 reasons. I told my mom I wanted to wear her lab coat, and I wanted to, specifically at 9 years old, learn about a woman in science. So that was me, and I just kind of feel like I knew from a young age I wanted to study science. But then specifically, I came into college pre-med. I wanted to be a doctor, but the summer after my first year, I studied with the National Cancer Institute with my 2 mentors there, and we studied life course obesity and endometrial cancer, and that's really where I fell in love with epidemiology. We looked at trends, we looked at risk ratios, and I realized that's when I really loved population health. And so I loved it so much that I came back. This is me this past summer, and basically I'm presenting my hysterectomy project. They're in more preliminary phase, but I thought I was going to be working on endometrial cancer again, but when reading the literature during the first part of the research this past summer, I realized that there's a huge lack of literature of hysterectomy, and I was like, this is a problem. So that's how I got to this project. I noticed that most of the studies are from the 90s. Most of the studies are outdated. They don't use nationally representative data, and hysterectomy, as we're about to go to see, is really important. So a hysterectomy, to clarify, is the partial or total removal of the uterus. It can include just the uterus, ovaries, and or cervix. So if I randomly picked 3 people in this room, at least one of those people, their mother will have had or has already had a hysterectomy. 1/3 of all women in the US, based on previous data, will have a hysterectomy in their lifetime. It's the most common, will have a hysterectomy before the age of 60. It's the most common surgery undergone by women in the United States, excepting for cesarean sections, and it's very high prevalence. By numbers, it's estimated that 600,000 hysterectomies are performed each year. Who gets these hysterectomies? 1, women with endometrial and cervical cancer. 2, women with endometriosis, fibroids. Both of these are benign uterine conditions. Uterine prolapse, which is exactly what it sounds like, and painful and irregular bleeding. So why is this important? Why do we need to know why so many women are getting hysterectomies? Well, 1, there are long-term complications, including pelvic floor dysfunction, osteoporosis, and heart disease. The last 2 are due to estrogen cycling. There are very large noted disparities in hysterectomy in the US. 1, it's been previously recorded that Black women are more likely to have a hysterectomy at a younger age and in general than white women. And the South overwhelmingly has a higher prevalence of hysterectomy than anywhere else in the United States. And finally, it's important for estimating gynecologic cancer rates. So what I mean by that is that women who undergo hysterectomy are obviously not at risk for endometrial cancer or cervical cancer if they also get the cervix removed, because you can't get cancer of the uterus if you don't have one. But imagine a situation in which there are a bunch of women and a certain percentage of them were obese. And obesity is a risk factor for endometrial cancer. But obesity is also a risk factor for fibroids, which, as we saw earlier, is a benign condition which often is an indication for hysterectomy. So these women are obese, they're at risk, they're at high risk for endometrial cancer, but they also have fibroids. So they have their uterus taken out before they would have endometrial cancer because they have fibroids. So even though they were at high risk for the cancer, they no longer are at risk for the cancer because they don't have a uterus. What this does is skew the population because they're still being included in the population when they're measuring rates of cancer, so they're still being put in the at-risk population, but they're no longer at risk, even though they have very similar risk factors as endometrial cancer. So as this says, failure to remove them can distort trends and patterns. So our rationale for this, as I explained with the baby pictures, was that no recent studies have been done evaluating hysterectomy in the US, and if they are recent, they are not nationally representative, whether it be by region, race, or age. So our hypothesis is that there was a slight decrease in hysterectomy over time. This comes from the fact that it has been shown previously using inpatient data, which means that you stay the night, that hysterectomy has been decreasing over time. We do think that hysterectomy has been decreasing over time, except we're estimating that it's not as, not significant, but it's not as drastic as how it has been presented before, because inpatient procedures don't include all of the hysterectomies being done because hysterectomy is increasingly becoming an outpatient procedure. So when you're only using inpatient data, you're missing a lot of the hysterectomies. So you're underestimating the amount of hysterectomies actually being performed in the US. And then two, as I just previously explained, hysterectomy and gynecologic cancers may share many of the same risk factors, and if you don't correct for that, it can skew cancer rates. So first, we looked at the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. It is the largest ongoing surveillance interview survey health system in the world. It annually interviews around 400,000 people. And we primarily used 2016 for our predictors analysis. We included around 175,000 women, and that was weighted back to the US population using census data to about 80 million women, much more nationally representative. And then we also used BRCAs for our trends analysis. We used the same inclusion criteria for 2000 to 2016. So here are our trends in hysterectomy prevalence. We saw approximately a 3% decrease from 2000 to 2016. Also, to clarify, I said updated, like we wanted updated data. 2016 is the most recent data available. So we only saw a 3% decrease comparatively. So ignore the y-axis here, but this 2013 paper used the nationwide inpatient surveillance system, I think that's what it's called. It's NIS, and it's only inpatient data. They, as you can see, so if you start at 2000, they show a much steeper decrease than we do, and in the paper itself, they don't have a graph reporting this, but this is just a good visual. So in the paper itself, it says that between 2002 and 2010. So between 2002 and 2010, it says that there was a 36% decrease in hysterectomy. So seeing that they actually used here in their paper, they used raw data, and we were using prevalence rates. But I did plot the slopes of them, like what we saw and what they saw next to each other. And as you can see, compared to nationally representative data, this inpatient data is way underestimating how many women are actually getting hysterectomies. And another study using NIS, I think from 2015 actually, said from 2002 to 2012 that it was a 50% decrease. So that's a pretty big difference compared to 3%. We also looked at hysterectomy by race. Overall, it is decreasing, and overall non-Hispanic Black women are still seen as having the highest prevalence, although you can see that closer to 2016, the Black-white gap does get smaller. Interestingly, Hispanic women have the largest decrease over time. And then we also looked at it by region. So, like I showed earlier, the South has a very high prevalence of hysterectomy. everything was decreasing over time, but the Midwest, the line in purple, as you can see, it kind of stayed about even the whole time. But it's just pretty interesting to look about how each region is declining their use in hysterectomy. So to estimate the likelihood of a woman having a hysterectomy, to find the predictors of a hysterectomy, oh, that's not what I meant. We made a multiple logistic regression model to find the odds ratios, which is just a fancy stats way of saying the likelihood of someone having whatever you're looking for. So for us, it's the likelihood of a woman having a hysterectomy. We first put into our model these 4 factors: age, race, BMI, and smoking status, because we know they are associated with gynecologic cancers. And then we also put in our hypothesized predictors, which included socioeconomic factors like education, insurance, and income, as well as regional factors and history of a Pap test. We used that as a potential proxy variable to see if women were having access to gynecologic care. So when we put these into our model, it basically it puts out the probability while also holding all of these constant and correcting for all of them, so that we know that these aren't influencing each other, that are not confounding each other. So here are our results. Our hysterectomy prevalence using updated data was actually lower than previously reported. We found 1 in 4, it's still very high, but instead of 1 in 3, we found 1 in 4. For race and ethnicity, we actually did not find a significant association in Black women. We did see one in Black women over 50, but we did not see overall with Black women, which is in contrary to what previous studies have been saying. Now, they do have a higher prevalence, but when adjusted for all of these other factors, they are equally as likely of having a hysterectomy as white women. What we also saw was Hispanic women were 30% less likely than white women to be having a hysterectomy. By region, we saw that the South had a huge amount of hysterectomies, over 2 times. Now, here in Kentucky, just for example, here in Kentucky, it's 34%. Virginia, where I'm from, is 22%. And then when you get to places like Alabama, 42% of all women have had a hysterectomy, compared to the Northeast, like New York, only 15%. Other factors we saw associated with hysterectomy: elevated BMI, lower education, income, women who were current smokers, and then not having health insurance actually was a decreased probability of hysterectomy. Next, we used the National Health Interview Survey. It's similar to BRFIS, but smaller, but it's also nationally representative. We used 2015, and the reason we use it is that it collects important information on productive female factors that BRFIS did not show, so we could see more about more things pertinent to endometrial cancer and stuff like that. So this included around 13,000 women, which weighted back to 85 million women. The variables we included here, we included the same variables as our BRFIS model, but we added these: age at menarche, age at first period, age at first birth, number of live births, family history of gynecologic cancer, and hormone replacement therapy use. What we found was increased likelihood for family history, hormonal replacement therapy, Paris women, that means that they've had a child, and then women who were over 25 at their first live birth were actually less likely to have a hysterectomy. So our conclusions: we did see slight declines in hysterectomy prevalence from 2000 to 2016, but conversely to previous studies, we only saw slight declines. Other studies are seeing upwards to 50%, while we saw 3%. So we do think that hysterectomy is being underestimated in the country if you're only using inpatient data. There were strong regional differences, especially in the South. Further research is definitely needed because we don't know why this is happening, but we do know repeatedly over and over for years that it is happening. Black women were equally likely as white women to have a hysterectomy. That is also a new finding using nationally representative data, but it will be interesting if this is reproducible in if there are other nationally representative populations we could look at. And we also found that adjusting for hysterectomy may remove women at high risk from the gynecologic at high risk from the population for gynecologic cancer, which means that we are currently underestimating cancer rates because we have too many people in the at-risk population. So here are my acknowledgements. Obviously UVA, but then I did my research for the past 2 summers / through this year at the National Cancer Institute in Rockville. These are my amazing mentors. They've really helped me a lot, and they're the reason I know how to do this kind of stuff. And I have slides if anyone wants to know any specific numbers. Yes?
Have you noticed any socioeconomic or social determinant differences between the South and the North populations, since they vary so much in their rates of hysterectomy?
Let me go back. So we did, seeing that we corrected for, obviously, like you just said, there are differences in socioeconomic factors between regions, but because we adjusted for all of them, it shouldn't matter in our model because they're all being held constant. Is that what you're asking?
I'm just wondering if there's any socioeconomic indicators or determinants that just kind of stick out. It's like, oh, the North has higher this or lower this compared to the South.
Well, the North did have a higher income than, here, I'll actually, no, actually I don't have that. But the North had a higher income than the South, and lower smoking status, things like that. So if we were just looking at a univariable corrected logistic regression model, then that would play into it. So we did see things like that, but this was all, all these covariates were corrected for each other. Yes?
Was prevalence of disease that causes a hysterectomy corrected for too, or is there a disparity in things that would make you get a hysterectomy across the country?
So there are definitely disparities in the things you would make, what would make you have a hysterectomy in the country. For example, Black women are at a higher risk for fibroids than white women are, but also endometrial and cervical cancer. But with using this survey data, we did not have indication for hysterectomy, so we don't actually know why these women had a hysterectomy. It's definitely something we would have loved to know so we could correct for it, but we don't know because we didn't have the data.
Thank you.
Yes?
Did you look at any other alternative treatment comparisons, such as maybe chemotherapy, radiation, or just a resection instead of a complete hysterectomy? Is that is this issue due to a variance in preferred treatment?
So that's, we don't know, but that's definitely a hypothesis that we've talked about, saying we think there's, in the South, there's so many things, and we corrected for so many things that personally, I believe that it might have something to do with provider preference. Now, I just said personally believe, we don't have anything to back that up. That's just something that I would love to go into further research on, but we don't know. Treatments have changed over the years. Now a lot of these things can be treated hormonally, but things could vary on cost and coverage and stigma within, stigma within cultures on, is it okay for a woman to go on birth control and stuff like that. So I would love to go into and finding out why things are so high in the South and stuff like provider preference, but we're not really there yet. Yes?
So you just mentioned that some of these treatments have changed over time. Do you think that could be related to some of the differences you mentioned between some of the older women versus the younger women you looked at?
Yes, definitely. Women now are getting less and less abdominal hysterectomies. Those are the most invasive. Now it's often laparoscopic. But we didn't have, our data doesn't show how they had their hysterectomy. So we really can't correct for something like that. But that is definitely something that in our paper that we address and say we don't know this, but there definitely could be, based on differences in how they had their hysterectomy, especially in older women who most likely had a full abdominal hysterectomy. Yes?
I noticed in your second data set that one of the points you examined included the age of menarche. Was there any correlation from that data or no?
No, there was not. I don't know why I'm going this way, that's the wrong way in the slides. Yes, there was not, that's just why I didn't show it, but yeah, nope.
We are out of time. If you have further question about our speaker, you might talk with her after the session. And let's thank her once again for her nice.